Over my years as a gamer, I've played lots of first-person shooter games, but up until a few weeks ago, I had never played a game in Electronic Arts' popular Battlefield franchise. I played the Battlefield 1 open beta on both Xbox One and PC for around 10 hours, and have some takeaways from my experience. But before I begin with my impressions, I first have to compliment EA on something. The Battlefield 1 open beta legitimately felt like it was in beta, not a finished product. There were server issues, bugs, and glitches, and horrible optimization problems on PC. All too often nowadays, a game developer releases a finished game as a beta just as a way to build hype for the release. Now, as one can't compliment EA without immediately insulting them afterwards. I will begin my impressions with the most impressive part of my experience, which was the graphics. On Xbox, the game ran at a pretty consistent 60 frames and had vivid detail in its textures. Sandstorm particle effects blew me away, and the explosions had an insane level of realism. I believe the game ran at 1080p on Xbox, but I can't verify this. But I can assure you the game ran at a resolution higher than 720p, and if it was lower than 1080p, it had no meaningful impact on the game. On PC, I played in 1080p on the Ultra preset and averaged about 80 frames per second on my mid-tier gaming rig. The improved textures were noticeably sharper, but not enough to really justify playing on PC over console, especially considering Origin's incompetency. The 80 frames per second was also noticeably smoother, but again, not large enough to impact to recommend switching to PC if you were planning on playing on console. The big strike against. As for the gameplay, I wasn't as impressed. The controls were fine on console, your usual twin-stick shooter generic button combo, but the alternate control options were lackluster at best. PC controls were also pretty standard, but having to crouch and steady scope on a sniper by pressing Control plus Shift was painful and forced me to sacrifice my left strike. The class system was rather disappointing. I mostly played Scout, and when I tried the other roles, I had trouble trying to find the difference between them. They all seemed to use strangely shaped Counter-Strike AK clones and a generic pistol. I also didn't find out you could change your weapon loadout until around 6 hours in, but hopefully a tutorial in the final game will fix that. I feel like the game was very well balanced for a game with as many weapons and vehicles, but was still dwarfed by games such as Counter-Strike and Overwatch. This is how I felt for most of my experience. Battlefield 1 is a jack of most trades, master of one. And while the graphics were impressive, I felt like the art direction was very generic for a shooter in a unique time-place. I would have liked to see a more creative art than an updated Dust 2 with train tracks. At this point, I've now played about as much Battlefield as I have Call of Duty, and I can see them as polar opposites. Call of Duty had horrible gameplay mechanics, terrible balancing, an overcomplicated control scheme, and graphics that felt more like an excuse to put 1080p on the back of a game box than a work of art. But I enjoyed every minute of COD I played. It was fast, ridiculous, and fun. It did help that I had a 1.88 KD in my first game of COD, and I averaged about 0.75 in BF. But that aside, I would still rather play that over Battlefield. Battlefield 1 is a technically great game, but not a fun one to play.